God, we thank you this night for giving us continued existence, for bringing us through lots of different experiences to this moment. We thank you for the community that gathers about us, for the food we eat, the people that care for us, and the work you've given us to do. This night, clear our minds and hearts that we might receive. Take away our preoccupations and our fears. Give us a strong sense that you not only love us, but will love us to fulfillment. Into your hands we commit this part of our lives, through Christ our Lord. Amen. We're coming now to the end of our study, our journey through the Beatitudes of Jesus. In fact, the one that we'll work with tonight technically is the last or the eighth of these qualities. I've been suggesting now since mid-September that one way of looking at the Beatitudes is to think of them as Jesus' theory or his philosophy of happiness. That here is Jesus' insight as to how we might move into that condition that I believe it's fair to say that all of us want when we're in our healthiest state. I don't know of anybody that is well that would not like to experience fulfillment and joy, a sense of completion, a sense of well-being. And this is Jesus' way of saying to us, these are the qualities that God will give you. These are the ways to do life that will make for happiness and will make for well-being. I've been suggesting all through this series, however, that Jesus is not the only philosopher of happiness that exists in the world. The very fact that happiness is so primal, something that so many people want, means that there are any number of opinions out there as to what our kind of species can do in order to experience happiness. And therefore, I've tried to make it clear that it's not at all conventional sometimes. Jesus' formula of happiness, it is not at all like what you have heard from other places. In fact, it could be that what you came to this study with, in terms of your philosophy of happiness, has really been jarred, has really been shattered. As you've heard Jesus say, here is the way I feel happiness has to come. I'd like for you to take now the piece of paper on the sheet that has the line. And if would somebody get me some more of this? This may be a longer night than I thought. Let me explain that what I have done here is to take the philosophy of happiness that is known as the Beatitudes, and I've called this happiness according to the man of Galilee. And then over on the left-hand sheet, I have taken a list of qualities that J.B. Phillips, the Anglican parish priest who blessed the whole English-speaking church back in the 50s by translating the scriptures into contemporary English. He first translated St. Paul's letters, and he has later translated the whole New Testament. But J.B. Phillips said if you would interview, thank you, Betty, if you would interview the average man on the street, that is, just stop somebody of the 20th century and say, what do you think are the qualities that help a person to fulfill himself and to get ahead, that instead of the qualities that are listed here in the Beatitudes, here he thinks is what you might well encounter. Blessed are the pushers, for they get on in the world. Blessed are the hard-boiled, for they never let life hurt them. Blessed are they who complain, for they get their way in the end. Blessed are the blasé, for they never worry over their sins. Blessed are the slave drivers, because they get results. Blessed are the knowledgeable men of the world, for they know their way around. Blessed are the troublemakers, for they make people take notice of them. And the reason that I thought it might be interesting just to set side by side two very different philosophies of happiness is to remind us that there are many, many ideas out there in the world as to what one has to be and what one has to do in order to experience fulfillment. And each one of us have the obligation of taking all of these conflicting ideas and deciding for ourselves which one we feel like is going to take us to that greatly sought-after goal. It is your responsibility, after we have talked about Jesus' philosophy of happiness, of deciding for yourself, I think he was right, I think he can be trusted, and I'm going to put this to the test, or to take some of other philosophies. The world is filled with them. There's a kind of naive notion among some people that all the religions of the world, if you get deep enough into them, are actually the same. You've probably heard the image of they're just different roads up the same mountain. But that is a superficial understanding of some of the basic differences that exist in the great world systems. We've talked in this study about the Buddha and his understanding that the way to get to happiness was not to engage lovingly with anything outside yourself. The Buddha says, he that loves 100 will have 100 woes. He that loves 50 will have 50 woes. He who loves no one will have no woes. In other words, the root of suffering is in your involvement with something outside yourself. And therefore the Buddha closes his eyes and closes himself off from the whole world and finds his nirvana of peace or happiness in total evasion of anything else, in total absorption, or total losing oneself in the all. Jesus, on the other hand, dies with his eyes wide open, with his arms stretched out, saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Jesus says we're not just to love our neighbors, but we are to love our enemies, that we are to encompass all of humanity in our affection. Now, it doesn't take a brilliant person to see, just like it doesn't take a brilliant person to read these two columns and realize that they both can't be right. Somewhere, sometime, we have to make some decisions about which way we feel is reality-based. And therefore, I suppose what I'd like to say is that the study of this portion of Scripture will probably go on after this class is over. Perhaps I have probed you and made you at least begin to ask again, what is the secret of happiness? What kind of qualities do I have to have? What kind of things do I have to do in order to come into that? And just like there's nobody that can do your eating for you, and nobody that can do your believing for you, so there is no one that can decide this except you. Abraham Lincoln said one time that everybody is about as happy as they make up their minds to be. And the point is, I think, is that you are finally responsible for the way you make up your mind. Nobody can make you happy against your will. No one can take happiness away from you if you have found your own secret. And therefore, in these studies of the Beatitudes, we have been thinking about Jesus' philosophy of happiness. I now pass over into your hands what you're going to do with it, what you're going to think of it. And I suggest that every one of us is responsible, finally, for his or her own happiness. Every one of us has to decide, what do I think is the nearest way to reality, and how am I going to walk that way? So tonight we come to the last of these Beatitudes, and I have placed it at the bottom of the sheet because, in a sense, it is the longest of all the Beatitudes. In one sense, it is repetitious. That is, what is said in the first is kind of restated in an enlarged form. But here are the words that I want us to focus on tonight. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when men revile you and persecute you, and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so men persecuted the prophets who were before you. Here it seems like to me is another one of those Beatitudes that on the surface is absolutely antithetical to our understanding of happiness. When you take the conventional notion that happiness is this sense of joy and well-being, and then have things like persecuted, reviled, slandered, spoken against falsely, it's very easy for a person to say, what on earth do these kinds of experiences have to do with happiness? And we've encountered this before. I remember the night we talked about mourning. It seems so far from a condition of happiness to a willingness to mourn. But we found out that night that it was the refusal to be scared out of loving by the possibility of mourning that it really was the secret of happiness. I believe if we will look deeply into this particular beatitude, we're going to find one of the most important things that Jesus has to say to us about the way our kind of species can fulfill ourselves. I think what Jesus is getting at here is something absolutely fundamental, even though I admit that on the surface it may seem very paradoxical. What is there about the experience of being willing to be persecuted that has an organic relationship to the concept or the reality of happiness? Well, I think what Jesus is trying to say to us is that pleasure is only a fraction of this reality called happiness. I would say that happiness, as Jesus is defining it, certainly includes the experience of pleasure, but it also involves a great deal more. What we're going to have to come to terms with is that there is a bigger kind of good for our species than just the experience of private pleasure. There is such a thing as an unpleasant good. Now, I think that thinkers long before Jesus had come to realize from their own experience that whenever a human being makes private, personal pleasure the be-all, end-all of that one's existence, the logical end of that is going to be boredom. If you never have any goal that is higher than simply your particular pleasure, what you happen to want to do, or something that keeps you from knowing any kind of suffering, if your only point of reference is only yourself, and if the only deciding factor in making up your mind about what to do is am I going to be pleased? Am I going to experience pleasure? When that is your modus operandi, then I think it is safe to say that you're going to wind up with a profound sense of boredom and emptiness. I once knew a lady. I crossed lives with her when she was in her 50s. But in her 19th year, this is long before I met her, she had inherited $300 million from her father, who was an oil tycoon. He had had nothing at all. He hit a big part of the East Texas oil field when he was just working as a wildcatter and working as a speculator. And suddenly this man who had had almost nothing became immensely wealthy. And this child of his only child, who had had very little education on how to handle that kind of wealth, suddenly when he died, or when he was killed actually, came into the possession of all this money. What that meant was that at 19, suddenly all the limits on her life were taken away. I mean, she was able to do anything she wanted to, have anything she desired, go anywhere that might please her. She had what most of us would probably say is an absolute paradise possibility. Suddenly no limits and every kind of possibility is available. Well, she began to do exactly what I think most people her age would have done with that circumstance, and that is she made her own pleasure the sole concern of all her decision-making. She went to every exotic place in the world she could think of. She had a Rolls Royce by the time she was 21, and then lamented, there was no other more expensive car to buy. There was nothing that she denied herself. She did everything in her power to get whatever it was that she wanted. And I'll give her credit that there was a profound enough part of her that began to realize that what she was getting from that way of doing life left out a big part of her humanness. And by the time that I met this woman, She had matured profoundly. She had lived through what pleasure has the power to give and all the things that pleasure cannot give to the human spirit. And therefore she taught me a great deal in the way she was handling this immense fortune. She taught me a great deal about what I think this beatitude is finally all about. Because what she had learned by experiencing the boredom that is always the logical end of the pleasure principle, if that's all you're thinking about, you're going to get to times when you cannot titillate yourself anymore, or you're going to be frustrated because you have not been able to do this or that when you wanted to. However the boredom overtakes you, having lived through what pleasure alone gets you, she had come to the profounder realization that she, being made in the image of God, was made to serve purposes that were longer and larger than herself. That she was in history not just to experience pleasure. Please don't hear me saying there's anything wrong with pleasure. All I'm saying is it's not enough. It's a cotton candy kind of experience that cannot serve as a total diet and be nourishing. There's not a thing wrong with pleasure. But if that's the only thing that you're seeking, then you're not going to be accessible to the larger reality of joy and well-being and happiness, because it simply goes down to the roots of how we're made, that we were put into history to serve purposes that are larger and longer than our individual existence. We are made in the image of God, who, when that one expressed himself, did not stay self-absorbed, did not stay in a hoarding, kind of inward turning posture. But when God fulfilled himself, God gave beyond himself. God began to share beyond himself with the whole creation that he was calling into being. God's joy did not come in staying focused solely on what do I want and how do I want it. It came in participating in a wider perspective. And therefore I think that what Jesus is saying here about persecution is that if you don't have something outside yourself that is important enough for you to risk some pain in serving it, if you have nothing bigger at work in your life than simply what do I want and how can I get it, if you are not somehow belonging to and serving a purpose that is larger and longer than your individual existence, then the way St. Paul defined the act of sin is going to describe you. He said, sin is falling short of the glory. Here is what we were intended to be, and when we settle for pleasure, we're settling for a fraction of what authentic happiness is all about. There's nothing wrong with pleasure. It is simply not enough. There are things in us that cry out to do, even sacrificially, in the service of purposes that are bigger and larger and longer than we are. Maxwell Anderson is a wonderful playwright who did a great deal of work in the early part of this century. He wrote a play called The Eve of St. Mark's. It's about a young man who is engaged to be married, on the verge of a very promising career of his own, but then his nation goes to war, and he has a great sense of patriotic duty that he needs to serve his country. Up to this point, there has been no conscription. Everything rests on the volunteering of individual citizens. And so he's talking to his fiancée one night, and he's wrestling with her about what he's feeling inside himself, the feeling he has that he needs to go and to serve his country, and to sacrifice his own career, and even to sacrifice some time with her in the service of that goal. Well, she's understandably upset about this. She doesn't want their life and their future to get disrupted. Everybody can understand that. And so she says to him, "Who is asking this of you? They don't have a right to ask it." And he replies, "Nobody's asking it, my dear. It is something inside myself that I don't quite understand, It is something in me that seems to be requiring it. It's that same inner self that turned to love you and no one else, that keeps saying, give more than is asked of you. I'm free to go or to stay back, except for that something in my mind. Now, this is what I mean when I suggest that there is such a thing as an unpleasant good. That is, there come moments when, even though our own pleasure is going to have to be sacrificed, there are purposes that seem to overarch my little individual existence, that seem to have significance for the whole of reality. And there's something in us that says there is a joy in serving those, even if it involves sacrifice and pain. There are times that to give up pleasure in the service of those kinds of enterprises brings us to a deeper joy than if we simply stay with what's the easiest and what's the most comfortable for me. William Shakespeare understood this quite well. In his play Henry V, he has the king speaking to his troops on the eve of the Battle of Agincourt, and he says to his men as they are about to face an unknown and perhaps very sacrificial future, "He that shall live this day and see old age will yearly on the vigil feast his friends, and say, tomorrow is St. Crispin's Day. Then he will strip his sleeve and show his scars, and say with pride, these wounds I got on Crispin's Day. And gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhood cheap when another speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's Day." You see, the point that these profound thinkers, Jesus, Shakespeare, Maxwell Anderson, are getting at is that if we really want to know our full potential of happiness, then recognizing that we were put into history to do more than simply experience pleasure is absolutely foundational. Why would anybody associate persecution with the experience of happiness? Because the truth is that we are made in the image of an all-inclusive reality, and we find some of our highest kinds of ecstasy, and not just in experiencing pleasure, but in serving purposes that are larger and longer than our own lives. Therefore, if you will acknowledge that there is such a thing as an unpleasant good, if you'll admit that there are ways to be happy even when you're not comfortable, that there's a kind of satisfaction that comes from sacrificing pleasure rather than satisfying it, then I think you can begin to understand what Jesus is getting at, and you realize that persecution and happiness are not as antithetical as you may have thought. This leads me on to a second thought, and that is, why should we have to be persecuted in this kind of world? Why does Jesus seem to indicate that if you are willing to serve causes that are longer and larger than you are, that this may well be what you're going to run into? Why is there persecution at all? Well, I think the answer to this goes back to one of the things that the Bible tells us about this world in which we're born. First thing it tells us is that it's a world that God created and God was pleased with. In the book of Genesis, you have that wonderful refrain, and God looked on what he had created, and behold, it was very, very good. Creation, as it came from God's hands, was exceedingly pleasing to God. But the other thing the Bible tells us is that the creatures who had been born into this divinely estimated good creation did not feel that way about it. From somewhere, a serpent who despised what God had created intrudes himself into the human conscience, raises the possibility that the way it is not good enough, and that it ought to be changed absolutely. And so the second thing that we're told is that the good creation has now become a fallen creation. What that means is that a rebellion or revolt or an absolute a revolt against the authority of God has taken place. G.K. Chesterton says it would be like going to a play, and right in the middle of the drama, one of the people on the stage said, "Look, I'm tired of doing this play the way the author wrote it. Let's kick out the author, let's kick out the director, let's, those of us on the stage, take over this drama and begin to improvise, and let's us finish it the way we want to." He said if that happened, then what you came to see would end very differently than what the author had intended. His understanding of what happened to our creation was that the actors who had been placed on the stage by another revolted against the author, threw out the director, and simply began to improvise on their own. It is God's nature to take nothing and move patiently through chaos to form and beauty. It is the rebellion spirit to take form and beauty, push it back into chaos, and if necessary, push it back into the nothingness from whence it came. There is something that is trying to unmake the world at the same time that God is trying to create the world. Now, if you have lived very long, you know that to be existential reality. You know that you have creative impulses that call you to do your best and your highest, and you know that there is some kind of mysterious darkness at work in you. Sometimes it takes the shape of inertia, where you're called on not to put forth the effort that if you put it forth would bring forth good. Sometimes you're seized by absolutely destructive impulses that come from you know not where. There is something that is trying to unmake us, that is trying to depress us, that is trying to turn our lives back into fragmentary chaos, as surely as there is that spirit that is trying to build and shape and bring up greater and greater harmony. We live in a battlefield. We live where there is this desire to create over against the desire to uncreate or to unmake. Now, one illustration of this is a story that's found in the Old Testament, where David, who had been king for many years and had designated his son Absalom to be his successor, when he was very old and was in a condition of pretty much weakness physically, found that Absalom could not wait until he died, that Absalom had gathered together all the discontents in the kingdom, had organized a rebellion that David knew nothing about, and was successful in driving his father the king from the throne. Once again, David had to become a fugitive, as he had been during the times of Saul. Well, he fled the city of Jerusalem, went out into the hills. His loyal troops gathered around him. And David said, "We have got to take the city again. We've got to put down this insurrection. This is not good for anybody. But I have one proviso. Though he has led a rebellion against me, Absalom is my son. So tomorrow when we fight, above all things, don't kill Absalom. Save Absalom at all cost." Now, this is a sign of what God is up against. I've had several sophomores say to me, "Why doesn't God destroy evil once and for all? Why doesn't he take his hand of omnipotence and crush evil out of existence?" And I always remind them that if God destroys the evil that is opposing him, he is destroying the creation that he created in the beginning. God has no enemies. God simply has rebel sons and daughters who have thrown the script out the window, who have taken the director and no longer heed his direction, who have taken over the play, who are improvising, but at a deep level, they are still his children. If God handled evil simply by destroying it, he would thereby fail in the purpose for creation. So if you want to know why does evil persist in a world that God has created, it's because all of us are Absaloms. All of us are beloved of God. We are in rebellion against his authority. In many cases, we're trying to unmake what he is trying to create, and God still loves us, and he's trying to redeem us rather than to destroy us. If this is our life situation, if we're in the midst of a conflict, then I think it comes pretty clear that the reason sometimes you have to be persecuted in the service of trying to work for the Creator is that once you align with one side, that means automatically you're going to become the enemy of the other. If this world was not characterized by conflict, if evil simply wasn't a reality that all of us had to contend with, then you could be righteous, you could be creative, and there would be no going against the grain. But since this is a fallen planet, since this is a seed situation in which all of us are involved, since there is the impulse to create and the drive to destroy that is a part of all of our experience, it follows that if you're going to align yourself with creativity, then that which is trying to unmake the world, that despises what God takes delight in, is going to find itself over against you. And if you stand for the right, for something larger and longer than you are, it follows that you may be persecuted for having made that particular alignment. I wonder when you first found out that standing up for the right might be a costly endeavor. When I graduated from high school, I remember the man who gave the commencement address was a very, very idealistic old man, and I remember he used the little piece of poetry, "Give to the world the best that you have, and the best will come back to you." And I really rose to that idealism. I thought, that's exactly what I want to do. Give to the world the best that you have, and the best will come back to you. Now, the first part of that is absolutely true. We are called on to give to the world the best that we have. But when did it first dawn on you that when you are doing that, what comes back is not always the best that the world has to offer, but you find that there is some kind of perverted unmaking that absolutely makes it difficult for you to do right? It came home for me when I had gone to the seminary for 1 year. I was a Baptist at that point in my journey, and I was serving in a rural church about 110 miles east of Louisville, Kentucky. It was in a tobacco-growing farm area down in Madison County. Well, I wanted to go and live among these people for the summer while the seminary was out. And I got down there, and there weren't but about 75 people, so there wasn't a full-time job to be done. And I needed to make some extra money, and so one of my old farmer deacons said, "Well, you got education," said, "Why don't you go and get a job measuring tobacco for the government?" Well, now, I had been raised in Nashville, Tennessee, which is not a huge city, but it's far removed from tobacco farms. And I knew nothing about that particular way of life, so that sounded like a good thing to me. So I went down to the agriculture department, and sure enough, they had some openings for people with my kind of educational background. Now, at that point in time, the government was supporting the price of tobacco, which meant they were guaranteeing the farmers so much money. But in order to do that, they had to limit how much tobacco each person could grow because the price was being supported. So my task was to go out to these mountain farmers and measure the fields where they were growing tobacco to make sure that they were not growing more tobacco than the government would allow. Well, it seemed like a very reasonable job to me. I passed all the tests. I learned how to do it. Boy, was I surprised when I got into the actual doing of this work. I found that because a lot of money was at stake, that there had been all kinds of bribery that had gotten woven into this system. I found that the words "a good fellow" meant exactly the opposite of what you would usually think. A good fellow was not good at all. He was the tobacco measurer who would sit in the shade up in the tree and let the farmer draw the diagrams of how much tobacco he was growing, and then how much he was really growing would never be known by the government. Well, I set out to do that work honestly. I set out to measure every field, to not take anything away, not to give anything, but just to do it as honestly as I felt a citizen ought to do. And I began to run into every kind of abuse that this particular Beatitude talks about. I was ordered off a farm once with a gun pointed at me. I was cursed out because I refused to take a bribe. I was told that nobody had ever done it this way and that I had no right to come in and disrupt the process. It was a very jarring experience. I was giving to the world the best that I had, and believe me, the best was not coming back to me. It was very, very unsettling to try to do something honestly and to find that you were in deep trouble. I would walk into country stores that summer, and 3 or 4 farmers would just get up and walk out, as if I was some kind of diseased person. Well, that really bothered me at first. It scared me because I had not really been subjected to that kind of pressure. But as the summer wore on, something inside of me began to get tougher. It dawned on me that this is a world that is in conflict between good and evil, and that if you are trying to serve on the side of creativity and fairness, the people that are not committed to that kind of principle are not going to take to you lightly. And so I began to find that even though I never enjoyed being berated or being accused of doing this, that, and the other, somehow as the summer wore on, there was a toughness that developed within, and I began to realize that the very reason that I was having those kind of experiences was because I was trying to do what anybody, if they looked at the big picture, would have said was right. Nobody thinks that thievery is right if they're being stolen from. Everybody thinks that robbery is wrong if they're on the short end of it. We need to take what we see so clearly and make it a universal picture. But anyway, what I'm saying is that I began to learn that in our kind of world, it is not always pleasant to try to stand for that which is right. And that stood me in good stead because I went on after seminary to become deeply involved in the 60s in what I thought was the moral idea whose time had come. I'm speaking about opening the way for black citizens to be full participants in the American dream. Many of the folk that I served in the church did not understand why a preacher would have to get involved in those kinds of struggles. And it was a time of great conflict. In trying to be for everybody, I found out that there were lots of segments of the society and in my church that were very, very upset. And on more than one occasion, in the deep of the night, I would pick up the phone, and there'd be this heavy breathing, and then a voice would say, "We know who you are. We know you're a mega lover, and we know how to take care of people like you," and then hang up. And I never enjoyed that experience. But I can remember thinking, God is a nigger lover, as well as a Caucasian lover, and an Indian lover, and an Eskimo lover, and an Englishman lover. God is a lover of everybody, and if I am going to be aligned with Him, then the people that don't want that love to be universal are not going to like it. The point I'm trying to make is that persecution sometimes helps you see that you're where you want to be. It's a kind of insignia that says, well, if this really is where I'm committed, then it's not surprising that the people that don't share that vision are not going to be happy about it. Now, it seems like to me that Jesus, in this particular beatitude, is getting at that tougher kind of happiness that sometimes has to be experienced apart from pleasure. That sometimes what has to happen is because we are committed to things that are bigger than we are, and because it's a fallen world, there are moments when giving to the world the best that you can ironically evokes the worst. And there is a kind of pleasure, not in some pathological liking to suffer, but in sensing that in this great struggle between that which is trying to create and that which is trying to unmake, that in this great struggle, I'm trying as best I can to be part of the answer and not part of the problem, and it's not surprising that that has a cost to it. The world is not going to get better on its own. Good is going to have to be intentionally embraced and ingeniously lived out, and sacrificially stood up for, the world is not going to automatically get better unless people who are committed to its creativity are willing to do that even at the expense of their pleasure. In conclusion, then, what Jesus says that if we're persecuted for righteousness' sake, we will be blessed. He says if we're persecuted for righteousness, there is the occasion to rejoice and be glad. Now, that suggests to me that there are benefits that come from the embracing of the unpleasant good that really can be counted on. And I'd like to just, in closing, identify what I think are 4 benefits that if you have the largest sense of happiness, inclusive of pleasure but not exhaustively related to pleasure, that there is such a thing as the unpleasant good. And if you realize that you really were created to serve purposes larger than your own pleasure, and then what can you likely get if you're willing to make these kind of commitments? Well, first of all, I found that opposition has a way of clarifying our motives and our methodology. It can often be a means of purifying and helping us to see more clearly why we're doing what we're doing and how we can do it better. I think it's significant that Jesus says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness." Not all the opposition we get is because we're committed to the right. Sometimes we're just foolish. Sometimes we're premature. Sometimes we're not using good judgment. So one of the things that I've always learned from opposition is that whenever I'm opposed or criticized, it gives me a fresh chance to look again at what I'm doing. And oftentimes I have found that my enemies are very insightful. They help me to see things that I'm doing that I did not realize, and therefore they give me the opportunity to clarify and deepen my sense of commitment and how I'm doing it. Hegel, the great philosopher in the several centuries ago, defines the way that the human mind works as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. It's called the Hegelian dialectic. What it means is that a proposition is proposed, which is a thesis, and then it evokes all of the opposition that is inherent to that position, which is the antithesis. And then as these two clash, there comes out of that a purified thesis, which is the synthesis. And this is the way that any good mind works. You get an idea, and then you begin to test it against everything else that you know, and you find that some of its original characteristics really are not valid, and so you let those go. In the interaction between that which opposes the thesis, it is winnowed and clarified and purified. Now, one of the things that persecution or opposition or criticism can do for us is that it can teach us things that we need to know. I try my best to say, whenever I'm opposed, if I get too defensive too quickly, I'm going to miss a chance to learn something. I'm going to miss a chance to grow. I learn when I come in contact with the not like myself. If I only stay with people who agree with me in everything, I am cut off from that which can correct or that which can enrich. So, first thing that I think you can honestly say is blessed about having opposition is that if we will listen to it, it can well teach us something. Second thing that I think being willing to be persecuted for some kind of larger than self concern is that you're bearing up under persecution ever lived to see. Someone has said that our human experience is like a relay race, that we receive the baton from the generations before us, we run a while, and then we hand it on to other generations. Edmund Burke said that history is the compact between the dead, the living, and the yet unborn. Now, many times, this particular kind of work is work for the future. Many times, the good that the person who is persecuted really accomplishes is a good that occurs way on down the way, that you don't ever see that happen. And yet I would suggest to you that if it is important to us that we hand on to our children and our children's children a kind of world and a kind of situation that will make for better living for them, then it's worth being persecuted now, even if we don't see the fruits of what we do. If we really take seriously that the ages are finally more significant than the hours, which is what Cicero said. He said, I'm more interested in the ages than in the hours. Then I'm willing to use the few hours that I have in history to try to serve the things that have a long-range implication. When Peter Marshall was the chaplain of the Senate, he prayed one morning, oh God, help us to see that it's better to fail in a cause that will ultimately succeed than succeed in a cause that will ultimately fail. That it is better to serve even if we don't see much come from our efforts, but in the long run that's going to bless. Better to fail in a cause that will ultimately succeed than to succeed in a cause that will ultimately fail. Remember I said we belong to things that are larger and longer than we are. So taking the long view is a third benefit that I see coming from being willing to be persecuted. The last thing that I see, and this may surprise you a bit if you can read it here on the board, the last way of blessing that I see that can come from the willingness to be persecuted is that here is a way that you can prepare yourself for the experience of death so that your dying will be done with greater confidence and with a greater sense of trust. My old mentor used to say that when I die, I'm going to get to the place that I have to say, if there's anything else, it's up to God. Now, as he recognized that death was the place of utter powerlessness, that when we die, our ability to make things happen has absolutely come to a halt, which means that trusting whatever is there in that extremity is absolutely essential. It's like swinging on a trapeze and letting go and turning in midair and being absolutely dependent on whatever else is on that other side. When I die, I'm going to get to the place that I have to say, if there's anything else, it's up to God. Now, I'd like to suggest that when we have been willing in the midst of our days to take a stand for something where we couldn't see the end from the beginning, where we felt like it was the right thing to do, and we knew that it was going to bring a lot of opposition to us, and we knew that we might suffer, and we had no idea which way the ball was going to ricochet. And yet somehow we felt under God that this was why we had been put into history. For this reason we had come to be matched to this hour. And so we had dared to venture beyond our own abilities to control and to provide. And then in those moments to find that when we got to the end of our rope, lo and behold, we weren't at the end of everything, that there was something else. There was a refuge and a strength, a present help in time of trouble. It's those experiences when you have risked beyond what your own resources could support, and you found that there is something on which you can depend. What that means is that when you face that ultimate relinquishment of having to become totally powerless, you have had some experience of the trustworthiness of God, and therefore the act of dying is not as fearful as it would be if you've never in all your life risked anything, but have always stayed with the pleasure principle. What I'm suggesting is that you and I can experience the trustworthiness of God in the midst of our living if we're willing to risk, and if we're willing to step out and trust the refuge and strength that is another name for the Almighty. I honestly believe that more people are afraid of dying than of death. It's not the experience of death as much as how am I going to get to it. And what I'm trying to suggest to you this evening is that if you are willing to see the happiness that can come from moving beyond pleasure, you and I can begin to know in the midst of our living in time and space that there is something on which we can depend. One of the great glories of doing the kind of work that I do, being a priest, is you get to be with people at the pivotal moments of their experience, at birth, at baptism, at times of great exhilaration, at times of great need, and then many times you get to be with them at the closing of life, when they're beginning to face the evening and the end of their existence. I guess across these 30-some-odd years that I've functioned as a minister, I've been with hundreds of folks as they were moving close to the gates of death. And I have to say to you that I can tell an honest difference in the way people cope with that mystery as to whether or not they have ever risked and found God to be trustworthy, or whether they are going into absolute unknownness and have no way experientially of being sure of what lies ahead. I remember going into an intensive care room once in Kentucky, and there was a lady who was probably in her mid-70s. She was the child of a wealthy family. She had married a very powerful and protective person. She had lived a life in which she had been largely sheltered, largely pampered. She had never really had to face life without the resources of father or husband or powerful family. If she had ever risked anything, I was not aware of it. And as I saw her approaching what we both knew was having to let go of everything that had been her security, letting go every connection that was a part of her life and history, there was sheer terror in her eyes. She had never let go a trapeze in midair at one time. Never in her life had she ever tested that God is our refuge and our strength, a very present help in time of trouble. And then again, I remember another old gentleman. He was a barber in a little Baptist church that I served in Hartsville, Tennessee. Unlettered, simple, not the kind of man that you would have been able to sustain a highly intellectual conversation with for very long. First time I met him, I was sitting in the barber's chair. I said, I hear the Methodist Church has just gotten a new minister. And he said, that's right. And I said, well, they tell me his name is Charles Dickens. I said, that's going to be easy to remember. And he was clipping along. I said, yeah, there are a lot of Dickens around here. And I remember thinking, wow, hello, out of seminary and into the non-literary world. But this old gentleman, though he didn't have a lot of education, he did have a kind of rough-hewn compassion for the downhearted. And so one time when the Ku Klux Klan in our community had really gotten aroused about something and were putting particular pressure on a black family, I remember he was the one white man in the whole community that stepped forward and said, this is not right. This is not the way American citizens ought to treat somebody who had served their country, which this black man had. And I remember that he incurred the wrath of the whole racist and Ku Klux Klan dimension of that community. They began to boycott his barbershop. They began to put all kinds of economic pressure on him, and yet they never were able to ruffle him. And I remember hearing that somebody said, you know, what is the difference between him and all the other people that we've been able to intimidate? We've been able to put the muscle on everybody and they fold. Why have we been so incapable of getting to this man? And somebody said, you're up against here a man who's already died. He's already been crucified with Christ. The life that he lives now by the faith of the Son of God. He has already known what it is to rest beyond his resources, and he's found that in the valley of the shadow of death, it is true there's somebody else that can be counted on. Do you remember that wonderful old story in the Old Testament about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? 3 Hebrews who had been taken prisoner to Babylon. King Nebuchadnezzar had erected a huge gold statue of himself, demanded that everybody bow down at certain times. And these Hebrews didn't make a big to-do of their civil disobedience. They simply were committed to Yahweh. They refused to bow the knee. And so when the times came and they didn't do what they were supposed to do, word got back to Nebuchadnezzar. And he called them in and said, if you don't bow the next time you hear the call, I'm going to throw you into the fiery furnace, which was the way the Persians would persecute the people that they hated the most. Well, the next time the sound came, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stayed on their feet. Nebuchadnezzar was furious. He said, fire the furnaces. They were fired 7 times hotter than they'd ever been. And then at the appropriate time, these 3 loyal Hebrews were thrown into that terrible fiery chaos. And Nebuchadnezzar came down a little while later to see their charred remains, and to his absolute amazement, as he looked into the flame, he saw not 3 people walking around, but he saw a 4th presence, like unto the Son of God. I heard an old black preacher say once as he was preaching on that, God doesn't save us from the flame. He saves us in the flame. There is another. In those places where we have to say, if there's anything else, it's up to God. And if you're willing to risk persecution in this life, you learn before you die that God can be counted on, and so you die in confidence. I think it's worth it. One last question. Have you ever in all your life been persecuted for something you did for Jesus? If you have, you know what I'm talking about. If you have